The moment Adrien Westfield finished laughing at my salary request, I knew exactly how this would end. He leaned back in his leather chair, wiping tears from his eyes like I'd just told him the funniest joke he'd heard all year. Women like you should be grateful for any salary. He chuckled, adjusting his expensive watch. Honestly, Lucia, considering your limited contributions here, I think we're being quite generous with what we already pay you. I smiled warmly and nodded. You're absolutely right, Adrien. I really appreciate you taking the time to explain that to me. I value working here so much, and I'm grateful for everything this company has given me. His eyebrows raised slightly at my response, probably expecting pushback or tears. Instead, I gathered my annual review papers, thanked him again for his honesty, and walked back to my desk with that same genuine smile. Before I dive deeper into what happened next, could you please take a few seconds to tell me in the comments where you're listening from? Because I want to know where my story is reaching. And please like, subscribe, and hit the bell, because what I'm about to share with you changed everything, and I think you'll want to hear how this unfolds. My name is Lucia Monteverde, and for 2 years I'd been working as a mid-level operations coordinator at Hartwell Associates, a boutique consulting firm that specialized in luxury brand management. We were small but influential, with clients who paid premium rates for our expertise in positioning high-end products and experiences. Adrien had founded the company 8 years earlier after leaving a larger consulting group. He was smart, I'll give him that, and he'd built something impressive. But there was always this underlying arrogance about him, especially toward the women on staff. He had this way of dismissing our ideas in meetings, then presenting nearly identical concepts as his own brilliant insights weeks later. The salary disparity was obvious. I'd done my research, talked quietly with colleagues, compared responsibilities and experience levels. I was earning 32% less than my male counterparts for identical work. So when my annual review came around, I'd prepared thoroughly, documented my contributions, and presented a clear case for adjustment. His reaction told me everything I needed to know about who Adrien Westfield really was beneath the polished exterior. What he didn't know was that I'd recognized his name the day I interviewed at Hartwell Associates. Not because of the consulting firm, but because my father had mentioned him several months earlier during one of our weekly phone calls. There's this gallery owner who won't leave me alone, Papa had said, sounding mildly amused but mostly exhausted. Adrien something. He keeps flying to exhibitions, sending elaborate proposals through my representation team. He's apparently building some private gallery space and desperately wants to host my retrospective. My father, Eduardo Monteverde, is one of the most respected contemporary ceramics artists in the world. His work sits in major museums across 4 continents, and collectors pay enormous sums for pieces from his earlier periods. He's spent 40 years perfecting techniques that blend traditional methods with modern conceptual approaches, creating sculptures that seem to breathe with life. The retrospective Adrien was pursuing represented 18 months of Papa's work, pieces that had never been displayed together, including several that museums had been requesting to borrow for years. For any gallery, particularly a private one trying to establish serious credibility, hosting Eduardo Monteverde's retrospective would be transformative. When I'd walked into Hartwell Associates for my interview and heard Adrien introduce himself, the connection clicked immediately, but I never mentioned it. I was curious to see what kind of person he was when he thought nobody was watching, when there were no personal stakes or family connections to influence his behavior. Over 2 years, I'd observed him carefully. I watched how he treated the receptionist when he thought clients weren't around. I noticed how he spoke to female employees versus male ones. I saw how he took credit for collaborative work and minimized contributions from anyone he considered beneath his status. And through those same 2 years, Papa would occasionally update me on the persistent gallery owner who seemed obsessed with proving his sophistication and cultural knowledge. He's written me 3 more letters, Papa would say, laughing softly. This time he included a 20-page analysis of my 2018 series, trying to demonstrate his deep understanding of my artistic vision. It's actually quite desperate. Adrien had invested his personal fortune into this gallery project. Through office conversations, I'd learned it wasn't just a business venture for him, it was his true passion, the thing he talked about with genuine emotion. He'd spent years cultivating relationships in the art world, studying movements and artists, transforming himself from a consultant into what he believed was a serious cultural patron. The morning after my salary review, I arrived at the office to find Adrien already there, which was unusual since he typically rolled in around 10. He was standing by the main window, still wearing yesterday's shirt, looking like he hadn't slept. When he saw me, his face went completely white. "Lucia," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need to speak with you immediately." I set down my bag and followed him into his office, maintaining the same pleasant demeanor I'd had the day before. He closed the door and turned to face me, his hands visibly trembling. "Your father," he said. "Eduardo Monteverde. That's your father." I nodded. "Yes, he is." "Why didn't you ever mention this?" "You never asked about my family," I replied honestly. "We don't typically discuss personal backgrounds here, do we?" His face crumpled as the full weight of the situation hit him. For 18 months, he'd been crafting this elaborate courtship of my father, presenting himself as a refined patron of the arts, someone worthy of hosting the most important exhibition of Papa's career. He'd flown to gallery openings in 3 different countries, sent carefully worded proposals through official channels, and invested enormous time and money into proving his cultural credibility. And the entire time, he'd been treating the artist's daughter like she was barely worth her paycheck. "Lucia, please, you have to understand." "Understand what?" I asked gently. "Yesterday, when we talked about your salary, I didn't realize." I watched him struggle to find words that could somehow undo what he'd revealed about himself. But there was no taking back the dismissive laughter, the casual cruelty, the assumption that I should be grateful for scraps. "Adrien, you don't need to explain anything to me," I said. "You were being honest about how you see my value here. I appreciate honesty. But your father, the retrospective, what about it?" He looked desperately around his office, grasping for some way to salvage the situation. Do you discuss work with him?" "Of course," I said simply. "We talk every week. Family dinner conversations, you know how it is. We share what's happening in our lives." The color drained from his face entirely. He understood now that there was no controlling this narrative, no way to manage the information flow. Papa would naturally hear about my work experiences through normal family conversation, the way children share their lives with parents who care about them. Adrien had spent years trying to convince my father that he was sophisticated, enlightened, someone who understood and respected artistic vision and the people who create beautiful things. But you can't respect art while disrespecting the artist's daughter. You can't claim to value creativity while dismissing the contributions of creative people. The devastating beauty of the situation was that I didn't need to do anything vindictive or dramatic. I just needed to be myself, a daughter who talks to her father about her life. "Lucia, please," Adrien whispered. "That retrospective means everything to me. It's not just business, it's my life's work. I've spent 8 years building towards something like this." I genuinely felt sorry for him in that moment, watching someone realize they'd destroyed their deepest dream through their own character flaws. But sympathy doesn't erase what someone reveals about themselves when they think there are no consequences. "Adrien, I would never say anything negative about you to my father," I said truthfully. "I don't gossip or complain about work. But when he asks how my job is going, how I'm being treated, whether I feel valued here, I answer honestly. That's what families do." He sank into his chair, understanding that the retrospective was already lost. Not because I would sabotage him, but because decent parents don't celebrate people who mistreat their children. My father would never work with someone who had dismissed his daughter's worth with laughter. Over the next several days, I watched Adrien transform into a different person. He started greeting me with nervous enthusiasm, asking about my projects with exaggerated interest, suggesting responsibilities that would better utilize my unique perspectives. It was painful to witness this desperate attempt to retroactively become the respectful employer he should have been all along. But respect that only emerges after someone discovers your connections isn't really respect at all. It's fear dressed up as courtesy. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning. Adrien's assistant knocked on my cubicle wall and told me he needed to see me immediately. When I entered his office, he was holding his phone with a stricken expression. "Your father's representation team just called," he said quietly. "They're declining the retrospective proposal. They said he's decided to work with other gallery partners for the foreseeable future." I nodded, unsurprised. Papa had probably made that decision during our Sunday dinner conversation, when I'd mentioned feeling undervalued at work and considering other opportunities. "Did they give a reason?" I asked. "They said he felt the gallery wouldn't be the right cultural fit." Adrien's voice cracked slightly. "Lucia, please, if there's anything I can do, any way to fix this." "There's nothing to fix," I said gently. "My father makes his own decisions about his work based on his own values. I would never presume to influence those choices." Which was completely true. I hadn't asked Papa to reject Adrien's proposal or even mentioned Adrien by name. I'd simply been honest about my work experience when he'd asked about my well-being, the way any caring parent would. But Papa was brilliant at reading between the lines. When your daughter mentions feeling dismissed and undervalued by her employer, and that employer happens to be desperately courting your professional collaboration, the implications become clear quickly. The gallery project didn't just lose the retrospective, it lost all credibility in serious art circles. Word travels fast in that world, and when Eduardo Monteverde declines to work with someone, other artists notice. Within weeks, several other planned exhibitions fell through. Adrien's dream of cultural legitimacy crumbled not through any vindictive action, but through the simple reality that character matters in relationships. He tried one last desperate gesture, offering me a promotion and substantial salary increase. But by then, I'd already accepted a position with a competing firm that had headhunted me after hearing about my availability. They offered 30% more than what Adrien was now frantically proposing, plus genuine respect for my expertise. On my last day at Hartwell Associates, Adrien stopped by my desk as I was packing my personal items. He looked like he'd aged 5 years in 5 weeks. "I want you to know," he said quietly, "that I realize now how wrong I was about everything. About your contributions, about your value, about who you are." I looked up at him, this man who had built his entire identity around being sophisticated and perceptive, yet had completely failed to recognize talent and worth when it was sitting 3 cubicles away from his office. "Adrien," I said, "the saddest part isn't that you were wrong about me. It's that you were wrong about yourself. You thought you could appreciate art while dismissing artists. You thought you could understand beauty while being ugly to people. That's not how any of this works." His face crumpled as the full weight of what he'd lost, not just professionally, but personally finally sank in. The gallery space he'd poured his heart and fortune into would never achieve the cultural significance he'd dreamed of. The artistic community he'd tried so hard to join had quietly closed its doors to him. And it all started with a laugh. One moment of casual cruelty that revealed everything about who he really was when he thought nobody important was watching. But someone was always watching. Someone was always listening. And in this case, that someone happened to be the daughter of the artist whose respect he needed most. As I walked out of Hartwell Associates for the final time, I thought about all the women who don't have famous fathers, who can't rely on family connections to deliver justice when they're treated poorly. They have to find other ways to prove their worth, other strategies to demand respect. But sometimes the universe provides its own perfect symmetry. Sometimes the person who dismisses you today turns out to need something from your family tomorrow. Sometimes karma arrives wrapped in the most beautiful irony you could imagine. The revenge wasn't elaborate or dramatic. It was simply the natural consequence of Adrien's own choices, played out through the connections he'd worked so hard to cultivate but had never really understood. Because here's what he never grasped about the art world, about my father's work, about the whole culture he was trying to join. It's built on recognizing value that others might miss, seeing beauty in unexpected places, understanding that worth isn't always obvious or loudly announced. Adrien had spent years studying art movements and memorizing artist biographies, thinking that knowledge would earn him respect. But he'd completely missed the most fundamental principle. If you can't recognize the humanity and value in the people right in front of you, you'll never truly understand what makes art meaningful. The last I heard, he'd closed the gallery space and returned to pure consulting work. Not because the business failed financially, but because his heart was never really in it after losing the retrospective. Without that cultural legitimacy he'd craved, the whole project felt hollow. Meanwhile, my father's work continues to inspire and challenge people around the world, displayed in galleries and museums that understand both the art and the artist behind it. Papa never asked me directly about what happened at Hartwell Associates, but during one of our Sunday calls, he mentioned something that made me smile. "You know me, huh?" he said. "I've learned that the best way to judge someone's character isn't by how they treat important people, but by how they treat people they think don't matter. That tells you everything you need to know about who they really are." I agreed completely, thinking about Adrien's laughter echoing in that office, and how it had ultimately echoed back to destroy everything he'd worked toward. But what happened next changed everything even more dramatically, in ways I never could have anticipated. 3 months after leaving Hartwell Associates, I was settling into my new role when I received a call that I never expected. It was from Diana Rothschild, the head curator at the Metropolitan Museum's Contemporary Art Division. "Lucia, I hope you don't mind me reaching out directly," she said. "Your father gave me your number. We've been following the situation with the Westfield Gallery, and frankly, we're concerned about some patterns we've been noticing in how certain gallerists have been approaching artists." I was confused. "I'm not sure I understand." Adrien Westfield has been making some rather desperate moves lately. He's been telling people in our circles that you somehow sabotaged his relationship with your father out of personal spite. He's painting himself as the victim of family politics. My stomach dropped. After everything, Adrien was still trying to control the narrative, still trying to make himself look like the wronged party. "That's not what happened at all," I said. "We know," Diana replied firmly, "because he's not the first gallery owner to approach us with this kind of story. There's been a troubling pattern of gallerists who treat their employees poorly, then claim they were unfairly targeted when artists' families find out about it." She explained that several prominent artists had been sharing similar experiences gallery owners and dealers who presented polished, cultured facades to the art world while treating their staff, particularly women and younger employees, with dismissiveness and disrespect. "We're organizing a panel discussion at the museum about ethics in arts representation," Diana continued. "We want to address how the art world sometimes enables bad behavior by focusing solely on cultural knowledge while ignoring character. Would you be willing to participate?" I was stunned. What had started as a personal experience with workplace discrimination was apparently part of a much larger conversation happening in art circles. "I don't know if I'm qualified to speak about that," I said hesitantly. "Lucia, you're exactly who needs to be speaking about this. You experienced the intersection of these issues firsthand. And your perspective as someone who works outside the traditional art world but has family connections to it is invaluable." The panel was scheduled for 6 weeks later, and as word spread about the topic, something unexpected happened. Other employees from galleries and art institutions began reaching out, sharing their own stories of mistreatment by people who presented themselves as sophisticated patrons of culture. One woman told me about a gallery director who sexually harassed female interns while giving speeches about the empowerment themes in women's art. Another described a museum administrator who paid female staff significantly less while publicly championing feminist artists. The stories kept coming, and a picture emerged of systematic problems in an industry that prided itself on progressive values and cultural sophistication. Meanwhile, Adrien's attempts to rehabilitate his reputation were backfiring spectacularly. He'd started giving interviews to art industry publications, positioning himself as someone who had been unfairly targeted by cancel culture and family nepotism. But every time he spoke publicly, he revealed more about his true character. In one particularly damaging interview, he actually said, "I've always treated my employees fairly, but some people expect special treatment just because of their family connections." The irony was lost on him completely. He was simultaneously admitting that he only reconsidered his treatment of me after discovering my family connections, while claiming that family connections shouldn't matter. Papa called me after reading that interview. "Mija," he said, his voice tight with controlled anger, I want you to know that I've spoken with several colleagues about this situation. We're going to make sure everyone understands exactly what kind of person Adrien Westfield is. Papa, you don't need to. Yes, I do, he interrupted. This isn't just about you anymore. This man is trying to damage your reputation to save his own. That's not acceptable. Within days, a statement appeared on my father's official website and social media accounts. It was carefully worded, but devastating. I recently became aware that gallery owner Adrien Westfield has been publicly discussing his declined proposal for representing my work, suggesting that personal family dynamics influenced my decision. I want to clarify that my choice was based solely on Mr. Prieston. Westfield's demonstrated character and values, which became apparent through his treatment of employees, particularly my daughter, who worked at his consulting firm. Art is about recognizing and celebrating human dignity and worth. I cannot support institutions or individuals who fail to uphold these basic principles in their daily interactions. The statement was shared hundreds of times within the art community. Other prominent artists began posting their own thoughts about the importance of character in cultural institutions. Gallery employees started speaking more openly about their experiences. Adrien's reputation didn't just suffer, it completely collapsed. But what happened next was even more devastating for him personally. His wife, Margaret, whom I'd met briefly at a few company events, filed for divorce. I learned about this through my former colleague Bethany, who still worked at Hartwell Associates. She called me 3 weeks after Papa's statement went public. "Lucia, you need to hear what's happening here," she said, her voice shaking with disbelief. "Margaret found out about everything. Not just how Adrien treated you, but about all the money he'd been spending on the gallery project without telling her. Apparently, Adrien had been using their joint savings and even their children's college funds to finance his cultural ambitions. Margaret had thought they were investing in gallery space for his retirement hobby, not that he was gambling their entire financial future on becoming a major art world player. She said the final straw wasn't even the money," Bethany continued. "It was reading your father's statement and realizing that her husband was the kind of person who would laugh at someone asking for fair pay, then try to destroy their reputation when there were consequences." The divorce proceedings revealed the full extent of Adrien's financial desperation. He'd taken out loans against their house, maxed out credit cards, and borrowed money from business partners to fund his gallery dreams. The retrospective rejection hadn't just ended his cultural aspirations, it had triggered a complete financial collapse. But the most brutal revelation came during the divorce mediation. Margaret's lawyer had requested character witnesses, and several former Hartwell Associates employees agreed to testify about Adrien's workplace behavior. They described a pattern of discrimination, particularly against women, that went far beyond what had happened to me. There were stories of pregnancy discrimination, sexual harassment, and systematic undervaluation of female employees' contributions. Margaret later told friends that she felt like she'd been married to a stranger. The man who came home every night talking about art and beauty and cultural significance was the same person who treated women as disposable and worthless during the day. The panel discussion at the Metropolitan Museum became a major event, with standing room only and live streaming to reach broader audiences. I shared my story, but so did a dozen other people who had experienced similar situations throughout the art world. The conversation expanded beyond just workplace issues. Artists began questioning their relationships with galleries and institutions that claimed to support progressive values while maintaining toxic internal cultures. Several major galleries implemented new policies around employee treatment and transparent pay scales. Museums began including character assessments and employee feedback in their evaluation processes for potential partners and board members. Adrien's consulting business, meanwhile, was hemorrhaging clients. Companies that had worked with Hartwell Associates for years were quietly moving their accounts elsewhere. The art world might seem separate from corporate consulting, but there's significant overlap in clientele, especially among luxury brands. Nobody wanted to be associated with someone who had become a symbol of hypocrisy and workplace discrimination. 6 months after the museum panel, I received an unexpected letter. It was from Adrien, handwritten on plain paper, not his usual expensive letterhead. "Lucia," it began, I know I have no right to contact you, and I understand if you don't read this. But I need you to know that I finally understand what I destroyed, not just for myself, but for everyone around me. Losing the retrospective was devastating, but it was nothing compared to losing my family's respect. My daughter won't speak to me. She said she's ashamed to share my name. My son asked me why I thought it was okay to treat people badly just because I could get away with it. I've been in therapy trying to understand how I became someone who could laugh at another person's worth. The therapist asked me when I started believing that success meant having the right to diminish others. I couldn't answer because I don't remember becoming that person. I'm not writing to ask for forgiveness or to try to fix what I broke. I just wanted you to know that your father was right about character being everything. I spent years studying art and completely missed the point of what makes it beautiful. I hope your new position values you the way you deserve. I hope other employers learn from my failures before they destroy good people's trust and fairness. The letter was signed simply Adrien, with no title or company affiliation. I never responded to it, but I kept the letter. Not out of forgiveness, but as a reminder of how completely someone can misunderstand their own life until the consequences catch up with them. The most beautiful irony of the entire situation was that my father's retrospective, when it finally happened 2 years later, was hosted by a collaborative of 3 museums working together. It became one of the most celebrated exhibitions of contemporary ceramics in recent history, reaching audiences that Adrien's private gallery never could have attracted. Papa dedicated the exhibition catalog to all the people whose worth is dismissed daily by those who mistake power for wisdom. At the opening reception, surrounded by art lovers and collectors and critics who genuinely understood the connection between beauty and humanity, I thought about Adrien's laughter echoing in that office. How that single moment of casual cruelty had unraveled everything he thought he'd built. The revenge wasn't something I had plotted or planned. It was simply the natural result of someone revealing their true character at exactly the wrong moment to exactly the wrong person. But the lasting impact went far beyond one man's downfall. The conversations that started with my story helped change how an entire industry thinks about the relationship between cultural sophistication and basic human decency. Because here's what Adrien never understood, and what I learned from watching everything unfold. You can't separate your character from your achievements. You can't claim to value beauty while being ugly to people. You can't understand art if you don't understand humanity. The art world, for all its flaws, ultimately recognizes authentic worth. And authenticity includes how you treat people when you think nobody important is watching. But somebody is always watching. Somebody is always listening. And sometimes that somebody turns out to be connected to everything you thought you wanted most. Adrien learned that lesson too late to save his dreams, his family, or his reputation. But maybe his failure can teach others to examine their own character before it's too late to change. If you've made it this far in my story, I want to ask you something. Think about how you treat people when you think there are no consequences. Think about whether you're building your success on a foundation that can withstand scrutiny from the people who matter most. Because karma doesn't always arrive as dramatically as it did in my situation. But it always arrives eventually, in ways you never expect, from directions you never considered. Please like this video if my story resonated with you. Subscribe if you want to hear more about standing up for yourself in impossible situations. And tell me in the comments about a time when someone underestimated you. I read every single comment, and I want to know how you handled it when someone dismissed your worth. Sometimes the best revenge is simply being exactly who you are when it matters most.